And joining us now on the debate in Montreal, Quebec, Antonia Maioni, Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University. In our nation's capital, John Ibbitson, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and University of Calgary Political Science Professor Tom Flanagan. And in Kingston, Ontario, Ned Franks, Professor Emeritus from the Queen's University Department of Political Studies. And as I welcome everybody to the program tonight, nice to see you all again, sort of on the line as it were, I want to start by playing some tape. Here's a guy that I suspect many people hadn't heard of just a few weeks ago, in this country certainly, and now he's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Roll tape, please.
Our country has a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority, and we have some deep and pressing problems. A huge deficit, deep social problems, and a political system in need of reform. For those reasons, I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. I believe that is the right way to provide this country with the strong, the stable, the good and decent government that I think we need so badly. Nick Clegg and I are both political leaders who want to put aside party differences and work hard for the common good and for the national interest.
There's the new Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron. Okay, let's go around the horn on this and let me just get first impressions of the deal that they have made to give what he calls stable, good and decent government in Great Britain. John Ibbitson, start us off. What'd you think? I
think it's an impressive deal. Great Britain faces challenges that Canada does not face. Their deficit situation, their economy, the state of social services, education in particular. So there is a need there for some stability at the national level. As well, it's not a federation. So if London isn't working, the whole country's not working. They simply can't afford the kind of political theater and gamesmanship that Ottawa has been enduring since 2004. So you had a rare case of a generational change, a new generation of leaders taking over, a new attitude that we have to get past the ideology and the rhetoric and get things done. And at least, on day 1 or 2 or 3, what looks like a solid, stable coalition government. Now, will it hold? Will it get through the budget?
Hold off on those questions for a while. Yes, hold off there. Let's get to first impressions. Antonia Maioni, what did you think when you heard about the deal?
Well, I think I agree in some ways. It was a deal that was both historic and hopeful. Historic because it is the first time that Great Britain will have a coalition government in peacetime. And very hopeful because, I think if I heard correctly, the new Prime Minister says that MPs are going to act like grown-ups in the House of Commons, which I think is a great way to start a new government, but also will probably hold lessons for parties on this side of the pond in Ottawa as well. Those lessons to be discussed as we proceed in this discussion tonight. Ned Franks, how about you on the deal?
Well, I found it a very interesting one, not least because it has things in it like parliaments lasting 5 years, like a vote on the electoral system changing to the single transferable vote, like having options where the Liberal Democrats can take off the whips and vote against the government if they want, and so on. It's a very long, detailed, and thorough agreement.
Okay, Tom Flanagan, your turn.
Well, I thought that by and large the Conservatives attained their main objectives. They get to start reducing government spending right away instead of waiting another year. And maybe Ned Franks and I have different information. I thought the referendum was going to be on the alternative vote, not STV. The alternative vote is not that much different in practice from first past the post, so it really doesn't amount to proportional representation. So it doesn't destabilize the party system in the way that proportional representation would. Nobody's going to be keen on closer integration with Europe right now, given the state of the euro. So I think the Conservatives have achieved their big objectives, and of course they have given some ground on other issues as they have to, and they've surrendered some cabinet posts to the Liberal Democrats. But it looks like a reasonable deal with the Conservatives in charge, pursuing their main policy objectives, and should offer stability.
Ned Franks, you just want to come back on a second and maybe help clarify which they've gone for, in fact, whether it's a single transferable vote or the one that Tom Flanagan just suggested?
Well, without naming it one way or the other, they're going to retain the constituency system, but make sure that all the votes count when it gets to a member being elected.
Okay, John, I'll bring you back in now on this. You know, does it seem viable at this stage for these two parties, which after all are a bit of strange bedfellows? It's not like, I guess if you were to make an analogy, a left-wing Liberal Party of Canada and a kind of moderate New Democratic Party, which aren't that far apart, getting into bed together. These two are a bit strange bedfellows. Do you think they can provide stable, good, decent, as they've called it, government over the next 3 years or 5 years or whatever?
Well, I think they can, and it's because, as I said, there's generational change. If this were a bunch of old political veterans, long in the tooth, fresh from many a war, trying to get a government together, if it were, say, Jack Layton and Michael Ignatieff trying to govern together, you might see ancient animosities undoing anything. But you do have two men, both in their early 40s, both with similar backgrounds. The Liberal Democrats never thought they'd live to see the day when they would get chauffeured around in limousines and get to sit in cabinet. The Conservatives know that they have to make this deal work if they're to be seen as a credible government that's able to set and carry out a national agenda. So it's in everyone's interest to make it work. And usually in politics, if it's in everyone's interest for something to happen, it happens.
Well, but it's not necessarily in the interest of backbenchers on the Tory backbench who aren't going to get some of those cabinet seats because they're going to Lib Dems. And Antonia, you know, yes, they're in government, but being on the backbench of a government is often the loneliest place in politics to be. So tell me this, how do you think they got this? How do you think they did this so quickly? This was not an Israeli situation where you can sit around for a month and still not know who the government is. They did this, relatively quickly.
They did it relatively quickly, and it's a bit of a surprise. There were a number of things that could have come out of those negotiations, and some people have been talking about more of an informal deal or some of the kinds of arrangements that we've known here in Canada as well in minority government situations. So to have a coalition of this magnitude and this depth and really this lockdown, because there's a lot of rules involved, is quite extraordinary. But I think that while it looks like it's viable and could provide stability, there are a couple of flags to watch out for. One is just what you mentioned, which is backbenchers, but not only in the government party, but also in the caucuses of the other parties. Remember that usually the grassroots and the caucus of the party, may have a different vision than the leader about what it takes to compromise on certain issues. And I think on certain things, that caucus will not be willing to compromise, and perhaps not even the grassroots. The other thing is that there's a big regional, even though it's not, as John pointed out, a federal country, there's a regional divide in the way that the vote shaped up. And the Conservatives have a lock on England, and they have a lock on sort of middle England outside of the big urban centres. But the big urban centres remain quite solidly New Labour, and New Labour also has quite a good representation in Scotland and Wales. So as Britain, is in many service areas such as healthcare, in decentralizing to some extent, I think that's going to be important as well.
Tom Flanagan, let me get your take on this strange bedfellows angle here, because you, of course, watched in this country as some strange bedfellows, some progressive conservatives and some reformers who didn't feel all that comfortable with each other, eventually found a way to work together and become one party. They've sort of got to do that here. How do you like their chances?
Well, I think it's important to realize the political configuration is different in the two countries. In Canada, you have the Conservatives with the largest block of seats, but then the party which is ideologically closest to the Conservatives is the Liberals. But the Liberals see themselves as a party of government, and so they certainly have no interest in forming a coalition with the Conservatives. So the natural coalition in Canada would be Liberals and New Democrats. But in order to make that work, the two of them would have to have a majority of seats together, as the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats do in Britain. Now, the difference in Britain is that the Liberal Democrats are a small party. They're not a candidate for government by themselves, and they are situated between Labour and the Conservatives. They could swing either way, and they are open to making a coalition because it's the only way they can be part of a government. So you can get this, another way of putting it is the Conservatives have no natural coalition partner in Canada. The New Democrats would give them the numbers they need, but they're too far apart philosophically. And the Bloc isn't a natural partner for anybody because they're an anti-system party. It's the kiss of death for any party that would try and become dependent on the Bloc. So it's not so much a matter, in my opinion, of personalities as of just the configuration, the size of the parties, and the strategic interests of the parties, and so something that can work in Britain and come together very quickly really has no counterpart at the present time in Canada.
No, fair enough. But Ned Franks, I wonder whether you were surprised when you heard that it was the Conservatives and the Lib Dems who were getting together, because after all, you know, the Liberal Democrats are an offshoot, sort of the Labour Party, and that seemed to be the more logical marriage, if you will. Were you surprised it didn't work out that way?
Well, it didn't surprise me, partly because historically there's been a melding of concerns at the very top of both the Conservative and Labour Party with similar views on social policy, what they used to call Butskelism. And the Liberal Democrats come out of that tradition of being social democrats, but also having a strong small L liberal sense there. It's a very interesting parliament, which is going to add some factors in that they haven't really experienced in Britain. What I've seen suggests that there's about 45% of the members of the House of Commons are going to be new to Parliament, and normally the turnover in Britain is well under 20%, 15% or so, and part of that's because 150 members resigned because of the problems in their budgets and the audit by the Auditor General. Then you add into that another thing that the Liberal Democrats really have bought into the system. More than half of their caucus is going to have some sort of ministerial position or position in the ministry, perhaps more accurately.
John, tell me, do you think there are lessons for our country here in the way that it all came together relatively smoothly there, and they've managed to put what even a week ago would have seemed like a very unlikely coalition together?
Well, I think there are potentially two lessons. The first is that plebiscite on referendum on proportional representation, or whatever it turns out to be. If it passes, then that's going to reopen the debate here in Canada. We would be the last major developed parliamentary democracy to have first past the post, and do we want to be the only one left? The second thing is, you know, if we go into another election, which we're almost certain to do within less than a year, almost certainly, I'm going to need to know if the Liberals and the NDP would form a coalition. Whether I cast a vote for the Conservatives, for the Liberals, or for the NDP will depend on whether that coalition is going to happen. And if it's happening in Great Britain, it could happen here. That would break wide open the ad hoc, bill by bill, as you go kind of parliaments, 3 of them, that we've had since 2004. That really would change the game.
Now, that's interesting. Let me follow up with Antonia on that, because, you know, politicians are studiously told to avoid answering who you might or might not hop into bed with after Election Day. You know, we got to see what the seat count is first and so on. But if John's right that this now suddenly becomes a legitimate question, had they better come up with some answers next time they're asked that?
Well, yes. I mean, during the campaign, the parties in Britain were pretty much at each other's throats, so it's kind of interesting to see them play nice now. But certainly I think Canadians will have it in the back of their mind. Remember, though, that the British example after this election is that it was the party with the largest number of seats that took the reins of power, and that, in effect, was able to build this coalition. So I think the democratic message is there. I mean, I think it's very difficult in 2010 to expect a party that didn't win at least a plurality of seats for that party leader to be prime minister. So I think that's an important lesson that we have. The other thing is, remember that, you know, Britain is not, I think Britain has become, in effect, infected or become a little bit more European in its way of thinking. We, on this side of the pond, are not in Europe. We're faced with the United States as our sort of natural neighbor. And so I don't know to what extent Canadians would be ready for this kind of coalition government. I think it would have to be explained much more clearly, because voters in Britain know what a coalition government is because of the European example. I think voters in Canada would need to have a lot more information about how it would work and whether it would be possible. And there's a lot of other factors, I think, that would be different.
Sure. I think they'd get it in Saskatchewan, because if my memory serves, that's about the last one I can remember in Canada, full coalition partners, the New Democrats and Liberals. Let's try this. I don't know how parochial or proud you're all feeling of your Canadian Parliament tonight, but there was a British academic paper that came out last year, and it pointed to Canada as an example of what not to do in a minority government situation. And let me just read a little excerpt of that, and then we'll talk about this. What is lacking referring to Canada, is a common understanding of the guiding principles which apply in periods of minority or coalition government, and a political understanding of how issues will be resolved to avoid bringing the Governor-General into political controversies. For minority government to work in Canada, there needs to be a dramatic shift in political culture which emphasizes cooperation and accommodation rather than conflict and partisanship. PMs leading minority governments should act with humility and recognize that they do not have a mandate to force their agendas through Parliament. Okay, I was laughing a little bit as I said that, but I guess I shouldn't have. Is this, Ned Franks, you come on in first, is this a fair criticism of what we've got going on here?
Well, we've had lots of different minority governments. Let me just begin by a bit of history that the Pearson minorities from 63 to 68 were amongst the most successful minorities that we've had in Canada in terms of passing legislation, in terms of passing significant legislation, in terms of working together. Now, Pearson was a diplomat, and that was his way of doing things. And in many ways, the last one, 65, 68, was an informal coalition between the Liberals and the NDP, although neither side ever admitted that. I think it very much depends on the character and intentions of the various parties involved. And my impression of Stephen Harper is that he's more of a warrior than a diplomat, and he's carrying on a very effective war against the other parties, and particularly the Liberals, since he got in. And I think it would be very hard for him personally to change into saying, well, let's get together with the NDP and agree on pensions and agree on the public service role and agree on support social programs. So I don't see at this point our political system being amenable to the kind of cooperation that the British academic thinks ought to happen in coalition governments.
Tom Flanagan, you know the current Prime Minister is better than anybody on this, of this grouping here tonight. What do you say in response to that quote that came from that British study?
Well, it's the typical supercilious stuff you get from the Brits. I wouldn't pay too much attention to it. I would go back to the point I made before. You got to look at the configuration. The Conservatives have no natural partner. Liberals certainly aren't going to be it, and the NDP is too far away, although they may agree with the Conservatives on a particular piece of legislation. So if you're going to govern in a minority government without a natural partner, there's only a few choices that you have to get things through. You can compromise on some issues, as the government has done. You can bully the opposition if they're afraid of an election, and Mr. Harper has done that at times. Or you can divide one or more of the opposition parties, and again, the Conservatives have done that most recently on the gun registry. They did it on Afghanistan early on. They've done it a couple of times. But that's about your choices. So you keep tacking back and forth, looking for partners for particular pieces of legislation, and sometimes most often it's been the Liberals, but sometimes it's been the NDP, sometimes it's been the Bloc. You play these games, but that's about all you can do if you don't have a natural partner. So it's not edifying. It's fascinating if you're interested in the mechanisms of politics. It's fascinating to watch. But if you're looking for edification, we better change the channel.
Well, don't anybody do that until I get asked, certainly not before I ask John Ibbitson this question, which is, let me pick up on that natural partner angle. This is a bit cheeky, John, but you and I love politics a little bit too much, so I can play this game with you. The Bloc Quebecois emerged from the loins of the original Progressive Conservative Party. Is it too much to say that if not a natural partner, there could be a modus vivendi there between the Conservative government and the Bloc Quebecois on some things?
Well, perhaps on an ad hoc basis, but fundamentally no. The old Progressive Conservative coalition was always an unnatural coalition between national resentments in Quebec and national resentments in the West, with some sort of accommodationist sentiment from the Ontario caucus. So that's why the Conservatives weren't in power very much. It was a hard coalition to keep together at the best of times. But now that we have a specific party that is determined to get Quebec out of the country, it makes it very toxic. There are days when the Bloc votes for Conservative legislation, and that's fine. The Bloc, on the whole, behaves quite responsibly in the House of Commons. It's not a disruptive party, but it is not a party that anyone can get anywhere near. I mean, Tom makes a good point, but I'd like to stress mine as well, in that it does change the politics of things. It would be very hard for the Liberals as a second party. Let's say they finish the next election in second place. It would be very hard for the Liberals to form a coalition because it would be the second and third place parties trumping the first place party. But it is tremendously important in a way it hasn't been before for us to know the intentions of these parties going in, because how we vote, each and every one of us, will depend on whether we want to see a coalition or whether we don't want to see a coalition of Liberals and NDPs. It will become probably the determining ballot question of the next campaign. And
let me just turn that on its end a little bit, Antonia, and go to you with this. The conventional wisdom, I think all across the country today, is that this parliament that we have right now is quote unquote dysfunctional. And everybody just says it is. Do you think it is?
Well, it's still there. I mean, it's quite a long-running minority government. So if it were truly dysfunctional, it wouldn't be around. I mean, we would have had an election already. We've had a sort of this quasi-stability punctuated by crises here and there when something happens or when we have a budget to fight about. But I think that on the whole, it's been able to function. So I think the dysfunctional is more in the way that it's been functioning in terms of the civility in the House, in terms of some of the more hardline positions that have been taken by the parties. We see, I think, a polarization of political life in Canada that, as some of the others have said, doesn't have much hope for compromise. And I think that's true. I think if you think about the way parties are positioning themselves, it's a lot more like what's going on in the United States in terms of the polarization between parties than it is about reaching for compromise, as apparently our natural example in Great Britain are doing.
No, Ned Franks, that's all true, and certainly it isn't a pleasant place, and it's not pleasant during question period. It's not supposed to be pleasant during question period or during debates. And yes, they've prorogued a couple of times, but would you say that the current House of Commons, the current Parliament, is dysfunctional?
Well, it depends how you measure it. In the Harper government up to the end of 2009, 50% of the bills introduced were passed. That's not bad for a minority parliament. That's better than average. Of course, the ones that didn't get passed were the central program ones on Senate reform and Get Tough on Crime. There are some rather funny things that have happened in the House. I'll give you an example here. This is called the Budget Implementation Act of this year. It's 880 pages.
Tell me you haven't read that.
I have not read it. I don't think anybody alive has.
Thank you.
But what it has is about 6 different acts, including an act for selling off AECL, an act changing environmental assessments, umpteen other things, and some not at all related to the budget. And that's doing an end run around Parliament, because last year when a similar bill was introduced, it got about 10 hours of committee hearing at the House of Commons, and then the Senate was so upset with it, it said that if it gets a bill like that again, it might divide it into several or refuse to pass it. So some of the ways of getting around a Parliament that doesn't pass bills are not very good for ensuring that Parliament actually does its job of looking closely at legislation, and this bill is one of those.
Okay, Tom, if this Parliament, and we'll use this as a premise, I'm not sure we've all agreed to this, but if this Parliament is, let's say, dysfunctional, for lack of a better word, do you think it's because of the players who happen to be there right now, or would it have more to do with the system of our government these days?
No, I don't think it's the personalities at all. I mean, look, Stephen Harper, I know him better, I think, than anybody else on the panel. He is a hard-nosed guy, but he's quite capable of cooperation when it suits his objectives. Otherwise, he could never have pulled off the merger with the Progressive Conservatives. He would, cooperate with the devil if it would bring him political power and stability. It's not personalities. It's the configuration. So if you don't have a natural partner, one of the things that you do under the heading of bullying the opposition is put a bunch of other stuff in your Budget Implementation Act, and basically you're daring the Liberals to defeat you over the budget. So you put all these other things in there with it. Is it some kind of parliamentary ideal? Probably not, but it's real world politics, and it's part of how you survive in these situations. Is Parliament dysfunctional? Well, Canada is better off right now than any other country in the developed world. Is it due to the Harper government? Not all of it by any means. Much of it's due to some good government by the Liberals previously. But I'm more worried about the state of the country than I am about living up to some abstract ideal of parliamentary perfection.
Gotcha. Okay, John Ibbitson, you get to go next, and you get to comment, first of all, on something that your brilliant Deputy Bureau Chief Campbell Clark wrote in the Globe on the topic that we are discussing. Here we go. In 6 years of minority parliaments, Campbell wrote, you would think Canada had seen all the cliffhanger twists, but we haven't seen this one. Two parties actually forming a real coalition with each holding ministerial posts in cabinet, talking about Great Britain, of course. Another election and another minority parliament, our new normal, could leave either Mr. Ignatieff or Mr. Harper in a mathematical position to form a coalition with the NDP, and a British example to point to. Canadians will certainly expect their political leaders to say if they would too. It's no longer quite as hypothetical. Let's take this British election now and really figure out how much of a precedent this is going to be for us going forward. I want you to give me a for instance, John, about when you're out on the hustings covering the next election campaign and the leaders are doing their press conferences. What kind of things are you going to be asking them that you might not have asked them before? Because after all, we've got this UK example staring us right in the face now.
Well, exactly. I would ask Michael Ignatieff, for example, if you win the most seats in the next parliament, but you do not have a majority, are you prepared to enter into coalition talks with the NDP, or would you proceed on an ad hoc basis? You would ask Jack Layton the same thing. Would you support the Liberals if they had the most seats, but not a majority? That is, as I've said before in the show, the acid question now. I slightly disagree with Tom on this, though. Whatever happens after the next election, we're probably going to see some changes of leadership. Possibly all three of the major parties are going to change leaders. If that happens, the other thing that we haven't talked about much on the show today might also come into play. Personalities can change situations. New leaders are able to do deals that old veteran leaders aren't able to do because there's less history among them. So there may be a possibility that after the next election, whatever happens, the real story is the changing of the leadership and how that affects coalitions and support in the House of Commons.
Well, without getting too far down the road here, but this is really within the realm of speculation, Antonia, I think Bob Rae would tell you that as a former NDP leader, he might be uniquely positioned as a future Liberal leader to bring some kind of formality to the relationship between those two parties. Now, New Democrats might say he's exactly the wrong person to do it because of his history of having left that party. But is this the kind of stuff we can look forward to going forward?
We might, but I mean, there's problems with any way you slice it, because some people in the NDP camp may not want to see Bob Rae, or some, so it kind of depends what the personalities are, as John suggested, and how it's going on. But I think what's even more important is that we're going to have to see what goes on in Britain, because we don't know how long this coalition is going to last. We don't know what the price of the coalition will be. Once we get to electoral reform in Great Britain, I agree, that's going to be a big test of this coalition to see what happens. But I think what also has to happen here in Canada is we have to be educated as voters on what a coalition means. We have to understand that it means that people from another party will be inside cabinet, will be holding cabinet posts. I think that we kind of get mixed up a little bit on what's a minority government, what's a coalition government, and we have to make it clear to voters. We have to, as voters, be empowered by that kind of information. And I think the other thing to remember is that there has to be some kind of democratic impulse. I think it would be very, very difficult for two parties to form a coalition of losers, as it's been called in the British example. I think that would be something that I think Canadians would pause before they were able to accept.
Ned Franks, take a look at history for us and tell us, when there is a full-blown coalition where the party with the most seats runs the government but offers, say, a few seats, as the Lib Dems are getting in Britain right now, when the next election comes along, who tends to get more rewarded? Who tends to get more punished? How does that tend to work out?
Well, we've had such a small experience with that in Canada that it's very hard to say. I mean, I can put it another way, that it depends on the success of the coalition, but normally it hurts the small partner, and normally what we've had in Canada is not really a coalition, an agreement, maybe formalized the way it was in Ontario in 1985. But we have so little experience with coalitions, I'm hesitant to say anything. I mean, our normal minority parliament means a single-party government, and that we seem to accept as a rule. And to go beyond that would involve two parties who are often quite strongly opposed, getting together and agreeing on something. I mean, the real problem is that our current Conservative government does not indulge in that sort of butt-skillism of having a social democratic sense of social programs, and that it can relate either to the Liberals or to the NDP, or for that matter even to the Bloc, which is basically a social democratic party.
And John, in our last minute here, I mean, and picking up from Ned's comments about the 1985 arrangement in Ontario, you know, you had the Peterson government in '85 held in there by the, you know, smaller Bob Rae NDP caucus at the time. 2 years later, there was an election. Rae almost got wiped out, and Peterson ended up with the biggest majority, one of the biggest majorities in history. I mean, if you're the small party in the arrangement, isn't that the cautionary tale you've got to keep in mind?
Sure it is, but the more important thing to keep in mind is that history is not always a precedent. Look, the last coalition government in Great Britain was the coalition between the Conservatives and Labour in the Second World War. That was a pretty successful government. They won the war, and Labour won the next election. Circumstances alter cases, and what kind of a coalition we would have in Canada, what circumstances it would confront, and how the various leaders would perform, just as the one in Great Britain, we don't know what the ultimate outcome would be. This could be the end of the Liberal Democratic Party in Great Britain. It could be the means by which the Liberal Democratic Party comes to power in the next election. We just have to watch.
And we will. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for this discussion today. Antonia Maioni in Montreal, John Ibbitson and Tom Flanagan in Ottawa, Ned Franks in Kingston. Good to have all of you on the line for us tonight. Thanks so much.